Hey folks, welcome to another Worldographer video. I'm Joe Wetzel, the creator of the program, and specifically we're talking about Worldographer 2025, which currently is in beta v1.07 as of now. I'm just going to create a new random map, which you can come to this dialog, check some of these boxes, and hit generate map, and it will create an interesting map right from the get-go for us. But we're going to get back to our Worldographer 101 videos, if you will. We've already gone through all of these tabs on the side, so you can do terrain and features and shapes and labels and so forth. And we've done many of the menus up here. Today we're going to focus on the next menu, one that we skipped here because there's a lot of functionality behind it, and that is our configure menu. And so because I know this is going to run long, let me dive right into it. So load and save configuration there at the top. We'll save all of the customizations that you've made to terrain, features, shapes, textures, that sort of shape styles, label styles, textures, that sort of thing. It'll save all of those things into a configuration file, including all of the additional terrain that you've loaded into Worldographer into one file so you can load it back in with load configuration later. By default, Worldographer, when you save your file, only saves the actual images that are used in your map, because as you would load several different maps and everything, they sort of would pile up. And so we don't want to save them all into the file, or else you'd have a huge file which would take quite a while to load and everything. So instead, when you save your file, your map file, it saves just the icons that are used. However, if you did want to set everything up and say, hey, I'm playing a Mediterranean themed campaign, and I need Egyptian icons and Greek icons and Roman icons and so forth from our various Patreons that we've done over the years, then you can load in those, save it one time, and then you can reload that configuration with those icons in one fell swoop. But we have other ways to get icons into the tool, which are also on this menu. For example, you can do configuration subfolders. And this is what I typically do the most often. I have a configuration folder set up on the computer already. By default, it is in your users Joe, in my case, documents, and then you would create a Worldographer folder in there. You don't want to use your program files Worldographer area, because that might get erased if you upgrade. The installer for Windows might uninstall and reinstall that folder, so you would lose those files. So you don't want to put anything there. You want to put it in your documents area. So you can create a Worldographer folder there, and by default, that's where it will look for this information or for these extra icons. But if you want to change it, you can go to change, and it will bring up a file chooser that lets you pick any folder on your computer or create one. I've already done that, for example. So in my case, I use Dropbox to save all of my files and everything. So I've got an Inkwell Assets and Patreon subfolder there. I should point out, through Patreon, we put out every month over 100 icons following a different theme. So we've done Greek and Roman and Egyptian, but we've also done Feywild and medieval Japan and galactic worlds and all sorts of stuff over the years, because we've had it running for 6 or 7 years now. That is one part of the configuration folder. But then how do you get these icons into the tool? You can go to Add Configuration Subfolders, and that's going to bring up the folder structure. Now I keep most of my icons in a year-by-year thing for the different Patreon icons that we've put out. I've also got some other icons in here as well in other folders. But so if I wanted to pull up Ottoman Empire stuff, I can go to 2024-07 and then expand this. And if I only want the classic World Kingdom stuff from the Ottoman Empire, I can do that. But if I also want to bring in Renaissance too, I can go and get classic World Kingdom Renaissance stuff as well. And so I can check any of these boxes, and I can then hit OK to bring them in. Now, one other additional thing about the configuration subfolder stuff is if you create a features, terrain, or textures folder in that top level of your configuration folder, so in my case, it would be my Patreon folder, then all of those would get loaded into Worldographer by default when you start up. Now, you don't want to put too many in there. If you put thousands in there, then you're going to run into memory problems at some point, depending on how much memory your computer has. But it is an option to put those there so that you can quickly get them in without even having to do this step. But I like to have them all sorted and organized and bring them in for the type of map that I'm working on. So I can hit OK here, and we get a little feedback here. Hey, it brought in 64 features. Those particular sets didn't have any new terrain. They didn't have any new textures. So if I go into features here, though, it's going to add those as categories. So I've got Renaissance, Classic World, and Ottoman Classic. And so I can see just what these are. And just so that we can see them a little bit better, I'm going to enlarge that so you can see what these icons look like. And then we can use them on our map. So if we wanted to have Renaissance Quarry in this location, we can stick it there. That is two ways to bring icons in already. The first being with the saved configuration. So once I were to save this, if I were to save configuration now, then those Ottoman and Renaissance icons would be part of that configuration. And then I could load it in. So we've talked about this configuration subfolder stuff. Next is add custom terrain, add custom features, and add custom textures. These are all very similar to each other, so I'm just going to deal with terrain because it's probably the most complicated of the three. It's got a couple of extra options. So I can hit add custom terrain, and it brings me a file chooser, which kind of points to the last thing that I opened in this way after I'd saved, and it's going to let me choose any of these icons here. And so if I wanted to, for example, bring in some terrain, and I have to think about what icon sets have terrain. So this Modern Cities did have some terrain. So this has these tiles that let you make a street network kind of thing. So if I wanted to deal with just these ones here that are with the flat tops of the hexes as opposed to the pointy tops of the hexes, I can bring in just those, hit open, and it brings me this dialog here. And this lets me customize all of those settings about these icons. So I can give it a new category. So I can call it modern, or whatever makes sense for me. I can override the size by default. If our icon is 300 pixels across, then it's going to default to 100%. However, if you also add in to the name here, there's information about that here as well, where I believe the first value is giving me the percentage of a hex to use, and then we've got the RGB code, and then we've got the alpha value from 0 to 100, and then we've got an elevation. Those are all built into the file name of the icons that we release. Now, if you're bringing in other icons that other people have made, you can either change those file names to match the format, and we've got that format detailed out, spec'd out on our website, or you can do that here where you can spell out the size, the elevation. This lets you pick a background color. Now, by default, actually, in Worldographer 2025, it will randomly sample. If you don't have color information in the file name, it will randomly sample that background. It'll pick, it's not random, it's picking 6 or 9 specific pixels, averages those, which are spread out amongst the graphic, averages those values and gives you a color that is the average of those. So you've got a background default. But back up here to the top, so the category, yeah, so we set the category to modern. If we wanted to set it to one of the default built-in ones, or even one that we've created already that we added, it'll be here in this list. If we want to override that size for all of the icons that we're bringing in, we can do it here, check the box, and then do it here. And then offset X and Y. This is something some icon sets add a little bit of additional space to the top of a terrain icon because they want to allow for protruding a mountain, for example, that might stick up outside of the hex borders. So they'll add a little bit of extra transparency space up there and then stick the top of the mountain in that area, but then they don't do anything below. Whereas in our case, we balance the icon so it's centered. So if we were to add 50 pixels towards the top of the icon for that kind of thing, then we would add 50 below. But if you're using an icon set that doesn't do that, Then you can set the tile height and push it down a little bit. And this is just has to be done with some trial and error, unfortunately, unless you wanted to open up their icon and see what the exact pixel count is and make a best guess for what that percentage should be as related to the 300 pixels per hex that we use by default for our icons. And then we also have an offset X, which does the same thing in the X direction, but that's less common. That's not needed as much. But if you're using some random icons somewhere that might not be centered properly, you have that as an option. And then we've got 2 rows for each of the icons that we're bringing in. One row does category and size. The other row does this background and the offset X, Y, and elevation. Elevation is that last value here. So in this case, 400 would be the value that we're going to get if we don't try to override it. What Worldographer does with elevation is it will, every time you place a terrain on the map, it's going to use that elevation value as well as the elevation values of the terrain adjacent that's already been placed, and some randomness to come up with a specific elevation for that particular hex. These are in feet is how we had imagined them. And then you can use this, or Worldographer, I should say, uses this just for doing rivers. That's the main thing that Worldographer uses it for. You can, so that your rivers generally flow downhill, although it's not a hard and fixed rule because we allow some percentage tolerance there to, because you might have a low point of a tall hex and a high point of a low hex. We allow some margin of error there for when we're generating rivers, but generally we look at that elevation to make sure our rivers flow downhill, basically. All right, so then I hit OK, and then if we flip back to the terrain tab over here, now we can see we've got this modern set, and you can see that we've got these here, and I can drop these into the appropriate hexes here, like so. And I can even zoom in to see them a little bit better. So that's that. As I said, add custom features is going to be the same thing, although you're not going to have the background color controls because features don't use backgrounds. Add custom textures just brings up the file chooser, and then it's up to you later to adjust the sizing, which I'll show you that in a moment here with the configure textures. With configure textures here, you can also bring in new icons for configure textures, terrain, or features. All of these dialogs will give you this add row functionality down here towards the bottom. So we can just hit add row, and then we can scroll down and we can choose a file. And we can pick this stadium floor, for example, texture, hit OK, and we can call it whatever we want, say stadium. And it's giving us a default size. In this case, this is going to make it so that one use of this image will fill a hex at 300. We are based on 300 pixels by default for the raw icons that we use in Worldographer. So I can hit apply here to just bring that one in, although I can also adjust any of the other values if I wanted to make our textures look bigger or smaller. You can adjust these width values. Hit apply, hit close. Now I can go into shapes for that, for texture, and I can pull up this list of shapes here. You know, it's scrolling off screen, but trust me, we've got a, let me scroll down a little bit more so I can see this better myself. There we go. So we've got a stadium texture there now that's been added, and I can create my new shape by going to new polygon. And we're going to see that it is in fact using that same light gray texture there. And to show you another example of that, if we go to configure textures and we picked this brick kind of thing here, let me switch that first actually. So let's switch to that brick. Brick floor red. So if I wanted to configure that and change it, we can go to configure and brick floor red. And if I wanted to show this as 800 pixels, we're going to see that it's going to be zoomed way in now. You know, so this is how you can change these textures to make them look different depending on what the needs are for your particular map. Because you might want to have a much more zoomed out view of things for a walkway on a settlement scale map, but I might want to zoom in with that same texture for a battle map. So that gives me that control. And then back up to here for configure terrain and configure features, I can go and pull up configure terrain. And here it's going to ask me, because there's a lot of different terrain and features in the tool, we're asking you what category do you want to adjust. So let's pick that new modern set. We hit continue here. Now here we have this add row functionality again, so we could add a new row, which will then let us pick an icon there from as a file chooser and background color and so forth, or we can adjust any of these if we wanted to. We can change the background color. Now these particular hexes span the entire width of the hex, and they are set up to 100%, and they are shaped like a hex, so we wouldn't see a background color unless if I did lower this down to 90%, now we would see some background color, but the background color would be almost a perfect match for that particular thing. So if I change the color as well, then we should see this when we zoom. Yeah, so now you can see that one particular one did shrink down a little bit, and now you can see that background color. Let me show one other thing with the configure terrain. So if I go to configure terrain and pick classic still, hit continue, this last section here, or next to last section here, related terrain, lets you, we call it shuffle there, but you can replace, as you're putting down a big swath of forest, for example, and you want to sprinkle in some heavy forest, and you want to sprinkle in some forested hills or some mixed forest, as opposed to just deciduous, you can use these settings here. You can select all the terrain that you think is related to that, and then add, the system, if you have shuffle on, will add in some of the other stuff. For example, if I just did a flood fill of this forest to replace all this, you can see that it put in a few other terrain types, not just forest. We've got that forested hill and mixed forest and so forth. That's what shuffle will do, and that's how to change shuffle on configure terrain. So I think that's it for this video, because these last couple of options, configure dynamic terrain, we went into a good bit of detail about recently because it's one of the new features in Worldographer. Settlement data is really specific to city and village maps, which we're going to be doing probably in our next series of Worldographer 101 videos. And World of Name video is really about the naming, partly for settlement data, so we'll probably keep it for that, but it also is used for the naming conventions of the cities and the country names. However, it is a pretty complicated dialogue in and of itself, so probably needs its own video, to be honest. But this covers all the different ways to bring icons into the tool, whether you're going to be doing a save a configuration where because you've loaded them in already, and then you can load it all in one step. You can do the configuration folder functionality to bring icons into the tool, whether it's terrain, features, or textures. Or if you have a few specific icons that you want to bring in, you can do the add custom terrain, features, and textures. And on the configure dialogs themselves, you've got that add row button to bring them in. And in case I didn't say it, the configure features functionality is almost identical to configure terrain. It's going to ask you for the type. It's going to give you a dialog with all of these icons that you've brought into the tool, or that are built into the tool that fit the criteria. So with that, again, I hope you're excited about the tool. It is in a late beta now. I expect to go to a full official release any week now. Thanks for your support. I hope that you give the Patreon a look. Have a great day. Bye.